All right, welcome to Talks at New Haven. I'm your host, Josh Robinson, and on today's episode, first before we get to, I'm jumping a little bit ahead of myself. This coffee's got me a little bit going here. But anyway, I'm Josh Robinson, and joining me today, as always, is my co-host. And on today's episode, now we're moving forward. We are going to be discussing marriage and God's design for marriage. So this should be an interesting episode. I think we have a lot of interesting things to talk about, and so
we're going to be. I know this is a Genesis series. We're going to spend a lot of time in the New Testament here, just because we have examples of Jesus expanding on this passage, and we have examples of Paul expanding on this passage. So, if we can use Jesus' words and Paul's words instead of our words, it may be a lot more helpful.
Yeah, lots of New Testament use of the Old Testament that we're going to look at this evening. So, anyway, if you're watching live on Facebook, give this video a like, give it a share it out with your friends. If you are watching live on YouTube, which we are live on YouTube, you can go ahead and give this video a thumbs up. That'll help people be able to find our videos and our content easier. And so with that being said, and with those formalities out of the way, we'll go ahead and we'll jump into our text this afternoon. And we'll get down to discussing some of the nitty-gritty. So we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 2. We're going to be looking at verses 24 through 25. And I'll go ahead and read the text for us, and then we can just kind of start into it. And so the Lord says through Moses, "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." So, Alton, you can go ahead and get us started for this evening.
All right, we're going to start a little bit backward this evening.
Start with 25.
We're going to start with verse 25, just because that kind of wraps up the creation story. So creation goes through Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at how the creation story wrapped up. And I'm going to start with a quote here from Trimper Longman in his commentary on Genesis. And he says, "The second creation account ends with the statement that the man and his not yet named wife were naked in the garden, but without shame. This description highlights humanity's innocence as they were created by God. They had nothing to hide, so they could stand before each other without clothes. This openness is more than physical and sexual, but also indicates their lack of emotional, psychological, and spiritual shame. Genesis 2 thus ends with an emphasis on the harmony between humanity and God, and thus among humans and with creation itself." So he's bringing up here, we see that they're not ashamed, and that is to show that there's a harmony here. They are in tune with each other. They have an understanding with each other. There's nothing to be ashamed about. There's nothing to feel guilty about. There's nothing to have shame over at this point, because they are fully innocent as created by God. They've not been tainted by sin yet. He finishes off here when Longman's talking about it, and he says that there's an emphasis here on the harmony between first humanity and God. So we see that there's a harmony between humanity and God. There's not strife there as man is rebelling against God, as we'll see starting in chapter 3. And then there's a harmony between humans. So there's not strife and struggle between man and woman over who should be in the lead, who should take control, who should have the power. There's not a struggle there. They understand their roles fully at that point. And then we see that there is harmony with creation itself. So we'll see coming up soon in Genesis chapter 3 that one of the punishments for sin is that man is going to struggle with bringing forth fruit and bringing forth things out of the ground. But at this point, man is in harmony with the earth, and man is in harmony with creation.
I think that's really interesting. Kind of touching on it from a different angle. You're talking about the shame part, and they're naked and they're unashamed, is what the text says. It's interesting that after the fall, that dynamic changes. Right. You see in verse 7 of chapter 3 that their eyes are both open, and they know that they're naked, And so they sew fig leaves together, and they made for themselves loincloths. And then right after that, we see God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. So there's shame there. Before God gets there, there's shame kind of in between the two of them and what they've done. And then they know they're going to have to stand before God. And so there's this shame. And the shame is accompanied with losing the nakedness between the two. And it leads to the two being closed. And so that's kind of how things are after the fall. Wasn't expecting to ask this question or expecting to go this way. But Rabbit Trail, do you think that a lot of what we see in our culture today, our pornographic culture, is trying to undo, in some ways, the curse in some of the fall in Genesis chapter 3, like maybe trying to undo, trying to take away the shame of nakedness.
I could see that argument being made, especially when you start back in like the sexual awakening, back in the 60s and 70s, when you're told, hey, don't be ashamed of your body.
Right.
Don't be ashamed of your sexuality.
Yeah.
Don't be ashamed. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Be proud of what you have. So I could see that in a way.
Yeah.
But it's still something that, even though people they say they're not ashamed, there's still an element of shame there.
Yeah.
And there's always going to be, because of the effects of sin on people.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I was listening to a conversation. I was not expecting to talk about this. I was listening to a conversation yesterday between two Christians on art and what could be portrayed in art, what shouldn't be portrayed in art, and the topic got on the topic of nakedness and where's the line with that and pornography and those types of things. So anyway, wasn't expected to even talk about that, but really, really interesting stuff there. That God creates man in this way. There's this unashamedness. There's nakedness in the marital relations. There's no shame. And then post-fall, we see that dynamic change a little bit. So
anyway. I think that goes to part of what we see the serpent say in Genesis 3, that if you eat of the tree, you will be like gods. So now we still have that serpent telling us you can be like gods. You don't have to be ashamed.
Right.
You can be like God.
Yeah. Good deal. Yeah. All right. So next could move us on here a little bit. We go on to verse 24, unless you had something else you wanted to add.
That's all I had for there for now.
All right.
We may be back.
You never know. Okay, so in verse 24, and so here we're gonna kind of get into God's design. So we've talked about the creation part here. It's kind of finishing off the creation week, right? Now we're going to get into God's design for marriage. So in verse 24, it says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." So what's going on here in verse 24, and what does this tell us about what a marriage is, right? So let's start there.
Yeah. So we'll start beginning of verse 24, and we see three separate commands here, basically.
Yep.
We see three separate descriptions of what this marriage is. And it starts off with, "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother."
Right.
So, why is that? Why does a man need to leave his father and his mother?
Yeah.
Why can he not just bring his wife into the house with them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And honestly, on Mother's Day, that's probably a question that some moms are asking who love their children and who have mama's boys and those types of things. But I was this week I was reading James Jordan's commentary. It's called Trees and Thorns. We've referred to it a little bit off and on throughout this series, but he says something here that's really, really good that I think hits on that question. He says, he says it this way. He says, "The biblical concept of marriage is nuclear, not clannish." Okay, he says, "The woman forsakes her family," Psalm 45:10, "but so does the man. Indeed, in Genesis, we find that Isaac did not live near Abraham, nor did Jacob live near Isaac. Yet the idea of forsaking does not mandate living apart. What it definitely does mean is that the young man is now the head of his own marriage and family. He is not governed by his father any longer. The father may still be the political head of the tribe, but not of the new marriage. The man forsakes his father and his mother. That is, he forsakes the old marriage and family, and he starts a new marriage and family, independent and separate from the old. Familialism is not a biblical perspective. So basically what he's saying is this. The reason why a man forsakes his father and mother is so that he can become the head of his own family, right? So there's this idea of headship, right? Whenever he is in his own family, the father is the head of that family. And so it would be, the biblical design is not to bring the woman and himself under the headship of that father as well. It's not clannish, it's nuclear, right? These two are supposed to split off, and they're supposed to form their own new thing, right? So that's what's going on here, and that's some of the context in which this is written. You know, during Israel's day, there's tribes, there's clans, those entire things. And so what the writer of Genesis, what Moses is talking about here, is that the family is supposed to be nuclear. It's supposed to split off. A man's supposed to be the head of his own home and his own marriage, and he should not be under the headship of his father. There is a new, for lack of better words, hierarchy structure here, because it's something entirely new. So,
yeah, and so I think that's something that we actually see around this area more often than people think.
Yeah,
and you see a lot of like, hey, this is my grandfather. He makes all the decisions for the family.
Yeah, kind of like acting as the family patriarch kind of deal.
Or you'll even see in some families a grandmother that everyone answers to.
Yeah, matriarch.
She makes all of the decisions. She decides where people are going to live.
Yeah.
She decides where people are going to move to.
Right.
The grandfather decides who everybody in the family is going to vote for.
That's exactly right.
Things like that you see, and that is in direct violation of Genesis 2:24, where it says that the man shall leave his father and mother. Now, it's not necessarily talking about physically leaving them, because it's really easy to physically leave
and still be connected
and
to
still
him.
be connected and still be listening to him.
Yeah.
A lot of times in Israel, they would get married and they would still live on the family compound.
Yeah.
But they were the one, like you were saying, they were the one that makes the decision now.
Yeah.
The young man, after being married, makes the decisions for his family.
Yeah. And, so I think that's spot on. I think that this is what this text is really aiming at here. It's showing these things are supposed to break off and become their own little things instead of having one family figure, whether it be a patriarch or a matriarch, ruling it all. That's not God's design for a marriage or for a family. James Jordan talks about, he can still be the head of a tribe or the clan, right? Mm-hmm. But he's not the head of your marriage. And so I think we'll actually touch on that a little bit later on in Ephesians 5, because Ephesians 5 talks about that a little bit. Some people I know take exemptions with the word patriarch. A lot of people don't like it. Simply what a patriarch is, or what a matriarch is, a patriarch simply means pater, and it means father rule is what it means. Right. So I would say that families should be father ruled, because that's God's design. The man leading, that kind of thing. But if you're talking about a patriarch or a matriarch in the sense of you've got a grandfather or a powerful family figure, that's not God's design. So words matter and definitions matter.
Right. So families should be patriarchal.
Right.
But it should not be there should not be a generational patriarchy.
Right. That's right. And the person breaking that down, coming down to the nuclear level here, the family patriarch with the father, even like that, most people hear that term, patriarchy, and they're thinking of this oppressive system, male-dominated leadership, that kind of, and that's not biblical patriarchy. That's not what the Bible means by father rule, right? And we're going to talk about that a little more. I hate to keep saying this, but we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we get to Ephesians. But biblical patriarchy looks entirely different from what most say feminists out there are fighting against when they're trying to smash the patriarchy. So So anyway, we'll touch on that a little bit here in a few minutes. But this is God's design, right? So a man leaves his father and his mother, right? That's number one. He holds fast to his wife, number two, and the two become one flesh. That's number three. That's three aspects to a marriage.
Right. So when he holds fast to his wife, what we're seeing there is kind of an extension of number one, that he leaves his father and his mother.
Right.
He elevates his wife now to number one most important in his family. To the number one most important person to him. She replaces his father and his mother as the most important person in his life. Yeah. Now his wife is the most important. She's the one that he makes his decisions to benefit.
Yeah, that's good. And Tremper Longman, he talks about this here. I don't know how deep I'm going to get into this quote, but basically he lays out in his commentary. He says, marriage, as defined by Genesis 2:24, has three essential components, which we'll now briefly elaborate. He says, this is why a man leaves his father and his mother. He says, for a man to move towards his new wife, he must leave his parents, right? And so, remember, we're talking about the act of headship here, right? Like, in order for him to become the head of his own family, he must come out from under the headship of his father, right? And then he says, and is united to this wife. Marriage means movement away from parents and towards one spouse. And then after that, he says, and the two become one flesh. He says that, all right, forewarning here, okay? The next part of this quote that I'm about to read, it's a little bit graphic, okay? So if you have children listening, might be a good time to pause and come back or to cover ears. But here's what Tremper Longman says, commenting on the two become one flesh. He says, sexual intimacy is an essential part of a marriage relationship. It is on the basis of Genesis 2:24 that we say that marital sex is the gift of God. In the sexual act, the two become one. This is true not only in the physical sense, where a man inserts his penis into his wife's vagina, but they also become one emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually as a husband and wife lose themselves in the other in an orgasm. So, wow, wasn't expecting to read that this evening, but Alton, what do you got to add to that?
Not a lot. So what he's saying there is that the sexual act is an important part of the two becoming one flesh. But he goes on to say, and others will say, that it's not the only part of the two becoming one flesh.
Yeah.
It says that, if we go back a little bit in Longman's commentary, he actually says that experience indicates that two people draw closer together by common experience and through communication. So that's another way that the two become one flesh.
Yeah.
You become one flesh by being family with each other.
Yeah.
You become one flesh by spending time with each other, knowing each other, talking to each other. I know I've been married now for almost 9 years.
Yeah.
And so I know my wife very well when it comes to what she likes, what she dislikes, those kind of things, because we've spent 9 years together. Yeah. We know that I know what she likes to eat. I know where she likes to go. I know those kind of things because that is our shared experience. Yeah. We've gone to those places together. We've eaten those things together. That kind of thing.
Yeah, that's good. Good deal. All right. So we've talked about the one flesh part here, but I want to back up here a second. I want to talk about the man clinging to his wife, and this might give us a good opportunity to transition into some other things here.
Okay.
But the clinging to his wife, what does it mean that the man clings to his wife? And so James Jordan has some interesting things to say about this. He says the man is to stick or to cling to his wife. This is the creation ordinance, and it is important to see what it means. The same word is used in reference with the covenant between God and Israel. The people are to stick or to cling to him, Deuteronomy 4:4, 10:20, 11:22, and 30:20. If a man is to cling to his wife, he will not be able to commit adultery. For he is stuck to his wife. the clinging does not refer only to mere sexual relations, which we have talked about, but we've also said that it refers to more than that as well, right? Tremper Longman even says that it refers to two becoming one emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. He says it doesn't only refer to mere sexual relations, but to the whole life, like what you were talking about, right? Mm-hmm. He says a married person must be careful about his affections and friendships with other members of the other sex. He says if a man clings to his wife, he will not be able to commit sinful divorce, and he won't be able to commit the sins of polygamy and bigamy, right? So that I think that's probably a good segue here because Jesus actually talks about these topics in marriage, right? About divorce and things like that.
He actually specifically quotes Genesis 2:24.
Yeah.
In Matthew 19.
Yeah.
So there we see in Matthew 19, we see, I'm going to back up just a little bit from where I am, and in Matthew 19:3, the Pharisees are coming up to Jesus like they tended to do to try to catch him up in something to show that he wasn't as smart as everyone thought he was. And they said, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? And so Jesus answered them, and he asked them, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female?
Yeah.
And he said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. And then the quote that's read at, or this passage that's read at every wedding ever.
Right.
What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate.
Right.
So we see Jesus pretty emphatically here saying there is no biblical grounds for divorce.
Yeah. So he's basically saying he's saying this, that it has always been God's design, his intention, that the two would be one and that they would remain one, right? Mm-hmm. Like that the two would not be torn asunder, is how I think the King James says it. Now, he talks about that Moses, later on he says, they ask him, they said, then why did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? And Jesus replies saying, well, because of your hardness of hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. I say to you that whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. So basically, Jesus says that the reason why there is provision made for divorce in the law of Moses is not because it was God's design, but rather because of the hardness of heart and sin.
Right. Yep. And so that kind of ties back into the polygamy point you mentioned just a minute ago.
Yep.
In that James Jordan commentary.
Right.
That's another thing we see in Genesis, that marriage is one man, one woman.
Right.
Because that's all there is one man and one woman.
Right.
So that is the plan for marriage there. But we see later on in Exodus that there are rules given for polygamy. There's rules given for a man marrying multiple women. Now, that's not because that was God's design.
Right.
God did not want man to marry multiple women.
Yep.
But just like with divorce, God made the rules due to the hardness of man's heart.
Right.
He said, hey, I don't want you to do this, but if you do it this way and it's not, he didn't say do it this way so that you are not sinning.
Yeah.
What he's saying is do it this way so that you're not hurting other people.
Yeah.
That's why God put those rules in place.
Yeah. And those laws for polygamy are found in Exodus 21, starting in verse 7 through 11. It says, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, so married to the slave woman here, right, and he decides to take another wife for himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. So she still has rights, marital rights, even though she is married to her owner, the person, her master here. And so we see here that there is a law that does allow for polygamy in this sense.
Right. So we see there through Moses in Exodus that God is allowing them to marry another woman.
Yeah.
Allowing them to bring in a second wife or a third wife.
Right.
But he's still not, even at that point, allowing for divorce for just any reason.
Right. Yeah. There's certain, and so again, so some people might hear what we're saying here, and they might be freaked out by that. Okay, they're like, "Whoa, didn't know that." But again, we want to affirm that this is not God's design. Right. That was not his intention, and that's exactly what we see Jesus saying in the Gospel of Matthew. Mm-hmm. There in, was it chapter 19?
Yeah, Matthew 19.
Yeah, in chapter 19, he says that this was not so from the beginning. Right? It was not God's design for a man and a woman to be torn asunder or to be divided, nor was it his design for there to be a man and two women, or two women or one woman and two men. That's not God's design. Or men and men, or women and women.
Right. But he says there, Jesus says, it's because of your hardness of heart, that Moses allowed you to divorce from your wife. And then he says, like you said, but from the beginning, it was not so.
Yep. So the freedom to do these things, or the allowance to do these things, are there because of sin. Like it's not God's good design. So we want to just affirm that. We just want to say that. So in case people are freaked out by hearing that. But we also don't want to pull punches, right? We want to expose people to the Bible and what it says, regardless if it's hard to hear or not. So, all right. So we've looked at what it means for the two to become, well, to back up. We saw what it means for a man to leave his father and mother. Mm-hmm. We've saw now what it looks like for the man to cling to his wife. And now we've looked at what it means for the two to become one flesh. So now we need to look at some other New Testament use of the Old Testament.
So at this point, we've kind of defined terms. Yeah. We've looked at some historical context for Genesis 2. Yeah. But now we're going to look at more practical stuff here in the New Testament, specifically in Ephesians 5. Yeah. So you read this passage this morning and just kind of skimmed through it in your sermon. Mm-hmm. So we're going to look at Ephesians 5, starting in verse 22. Yeah. And we'll hit on a couple of different places here throughout the rest of chapter 5 in Ephesians. Yeah. So it starts off in verse 22 and says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands."
Okay, all right.
So how many churches have you heard read that and just stop right there?
A lot.
So wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, you do you.
Yep, right. Yeah, you hear that pretty frequently. But it's really important here to notice what it is that God commands wives to do. First, he does tell them that they are submit to their own husbands as to the Lord. And so this, we're going to circle back around here a little bit and talk about the whole family, clan, patriarch thing. Right. He does tell them to submit to their own husbands. Submit to, I think it's here, or maybe it's...
Yeah, it's there in 22. Submit to your own husbands.
Yes, submit to your own husbands, right? So this is aiming at that clannish type of family thing.
Submit to your husband. Yeah. Don't submit to your husband's father. Don't submit to
somebody else in the church's husband or whatever. Right. Yep. So a wife is to submit to her own husband. And then here's the reason why. So in verse 23, we see the word "for" there. And that's you could basically replace "for" with "because." That's what it is. But it's for. Here's the reason why. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. So here's the reason why wives should submit to their husband. And he's going to talk about it a little bit more whenever we get to the end here. But there's something mysterious going on with marriage. Mm-hmm. There is this connection he is drawing here in the first couple of verses in Ephesians 5 that connects husbands and wives in their marriage to Christ and the church. And he says that wives are supposed to submit to their own husbands because that's what the church does with Christ. Right.
And we see right there in verse 23. So even as Christ is the head of the church, and then in between those two commas, his body.
Yep.
So the church, as we've heard many times, is the body of Christ.
Yep.
So Christ and the church are one flesh.
Yep.
Just as man and woman in marriage are one flesh. So if the church is supposed to submit to Christ, we see here that in a marriage, the woman is supposed to take the role of the church, while the man takes the role of Christ.
Yep. That's exactly right. So she should submit to her own husband, and she should do that because that's what the church does with Christ. The church submits to Christ as the head. Right. All right. So that's the command for wives. Right. This is the design for wives in marriage.
And this is where most people stop.
Yep.
But we're actually going to read on and see what husbands are supposed to do.
Men have a tall glass of water here. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Okay, so what kind of husband is it that a wife is supposed to submit to?
Right. She's supposed to submit to a husband that loves her in the same way that Christ loved the church.
And how is it that Christ loves the church? By giving himself up for her.
Right. So Christ died freely for the church.
Yep.
There's some husbands that cannot even be bothered to go to the store for their wife. But Christ freely went to the cross for his bride.
Yep, that's good. And it says that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. And so basically this is a reference to what Christ does with the church. Mm-hmm. Christ, because he gives himself up for the church, he sanctifies his bride. He cleanses her by the washing of water with the word. I'm assuming that is a reference to baptism. Maybe that's debatable, but I'm assuming just right off the bat that's probably a reference to baptism. And it says, so that, and the reason why he does this is so that he can present his bride to himself in splendor or beauty, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, so that she would be holy and without blemish. And
so we see here that the husband is his role in this relationship. His role in the marriage is not to be the boss. Yeah. His role is to disciple his wife. Yeah. His role is to, it says there, that he might sanctify her. Yeah. So we'll go ahead and we'll define more terms. What is sanctification?
Yeah, it's the process of becoming more like Christ. Right? Growing in holiness. There is a connection there between sanctification, something that is sanctified and made holy, set apart for holy use. Right. So that's what it means to be sanctified. You are set apart.
So that's the husband's job, is to help his wife to become set apart for a holy use. Yep. How intimidating of a task is that?
No, it's very
when
intimidating.
You read it that way.
Yep.
In your marriage, that is your job. Yep. To see that your wife is made useful for holiness.
Yeah, he says down at the bottom of verse 27 that she might be holy and without blemish. Yeah. Right.
So that's your job.
Yeah.
Your job in your marriage is to make sure that your wife can be presented as holy and sanctified and perfect.
Yeah. So whose responsibility is it in the marriage when the wife is not thriving spiritually? It's the heads. It's the heads. It's your responsibility as a husband that your wife would be presented to Christ holy and without blemish. And the reason why it's your responsibility is because in your marriage you're playing the part of Christ. Right. You're the priest. You're the king. You are like Christ. You are the head. And because of that, what Christ did as the head was he loved the church, gave himself up for her so that he might sanctify her, present her without spot or wrinkle or any blemish, and so that she's holy. So we are imitating that in our marriages, right? And so that's a tall order
we see a lot of people who they're excited to get married because they get to lead and they get to be the head of the household.
Right.
Like how often do you see men that are the head of the household?
Yeah.
And what they mean by head of the household is
I get to lay on the couch and watch football while you do all the clothes.
Right. They get to tell everybody what to do.
Yep.
They get to go out and do what they want. They come home when they want. They do whatever they want.
They have nobody to answer to.
The wife who is submitted to him takes care of the kids and keeps the house clean and makes sure there's food on the table and all of that. But that's not what we see here.
That's not biblical headship.
That's not what Paul's telling us to do.
Yep. No. That's not biblical headship. Biblical headship is not ruling your home with an iron scepter or with an iron crown. It is not being the tyrant of your home. It's not dishing out orders. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be time when you don't make decisions as the head of your home. But primarily what it means to be the head of your home is to give yourself up sacrificially for the good of your home. That's what it looks like to lead as a man.
And so I'm going to jump back a couple weeks now. And where is the best way for a young man to learn this before marriage?
Yeah.
Where's the best place for a young man to learn this? Yeah. And this is also going to go into what a husband's role is in a marriage.
Yeah. The
best place for a young man to learn this is through watching his father.
That's exactly right.
So we should be showing, not only doing this so that our wives will be made holy, and so that our wives will be used for holy purposes, we're also raising children who, in some cases, we're raising young men who in the future are going to need to fulfill this description of what a husband is.
Yeah, Paul in chapter 6, we're terrible chapter break. In chapter 6, it immediately goes into commandments for children. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go with you, that it may go well with you, and that you might live long in the land. Fathers, don't provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. Right. So your example, right? Your example. You should be setting and leading out. You should be setting the example for your children in your home, because they're going. I think one of the greatest problems in our world today is not that homes are patriarchal and father ruled, but it's that there's not enough father ruled homes,
right?
And that there aren't men passing on to the next generation the things that they need to see and learn, so that they can go to their own homes and apply them there. I think that is a huge problem today.
Right, and so we see a lot of problems now with fatherless homes. We see people complaining that there's so many fatherless homes that we have, and then they wonder why are there all these fatherless homes? Yeah. Well, let's look back a couple generations at the distant fathers, at the fathers who were the stern head of the household that never spoke with anyone else in the family other than to give orders. So we had that, and then we went to weak men in fatherless homes, and there's a very strong connection there.
Yeah, there's a very, very strong connection there. John Eldridge, in his book Wild at Heart, talks about that there's an epidemic of unfinished men. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's absolutely spot on. And because of that, I think that it's no coincidence that marriages right now in our country are at an all-time high for things like divorce. Like during the pandemic, they were big-time spikes in abuse, domestic abuse, things like that. I think that there's no coincidence that those things are happening right now in a time, in an age, where fathers have, for the most part, come out of the homes and have left children unfathered, or if they are there, they've done a poor job of doing it.
Right.
So, all right, so men, it is your job, husbands, it is your job that your wife would be presented holy and without blemish. That's on you, right? That is on you. You need to make sure that your wife's spiritual well-being is being taken care of. Right. All right, so now going on to verse 28, it says, now, In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. Oh, wow. So we should love ourselves in some way. But here, it's in reference here to the one flesh thing, right? The reason why you should love your wife as your body is because the two of you have been joined together in one flesh. You are now united together. And that reflects our union with Christ, right?
Right. The church is the body of Christ.
That's exactly right. We are in union with Christ. And so he says, you should love your wife as your own body. He who loves his wife loves himself. So there's a lot of implications there.
Mm-hmm.
He who loves his wife loves himself. So if you hate your wife, what does that say?
Right.
You hate yourself. And then you're talking poorly about Christ at that point. Right? Because there's this intimate, mysterious connection between marriage and the church and Christ. And so he says, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. All right, so men are supposed to love women as their own flesh. And not only that, but they're supposed to nourish them, right? That means that we are to be there for their well-being. We are to make sure that spiritually, psychologically, physically, they are thriving. That's what it means to nourish something, right? And then to cherish something, it means that we protect it, right? That we guard it. Very much like what Adam was supposed to do in the garden, right? You're supposed to work and keep it, or to work and guard it,
right.
That type of idea. So really interesting things going on there. So anyway, I'm hyped up on this coffee right now. So
yeah, so it's and this is a lot of, we see, I know they didn't have this reference in Genesis to make, but now we see the reference in the comparison of the man and his wife and Christ and his bride.
Yeah.
So anywhere in Scripture, and this is one a little bit off of where we are now, but anywhere in the New Testament that you see that Christ loves the church, anything you see Christ does for the church, you should also be willing to do for your bride.
That's right. Yep. And the reason why, here's some more of the ground here, starting in verse 31, going into 32. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. So there's Paul's reasoning for why a man should love his wife as his own flesh. So he's quoting from the text that we looked at this morning. But here's the connection point, right? To just show you this isn't our opinion, that marriage is mysteriously connected to Christ and the church. In verse 32, he says, this mystery is profound. I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. So Paul is saying that there is this intimate, mysterious connection between marriage and Christ and the church. So not our opinion, not our thoughts. Right smack dab there in Ephesians 5.
Yep. So, and then he finishes out the chapter. He says, let each one of you love his wife as himself. So there's the first command he gives. Yep. Love your wife as yourself.
Reminds you of love your neighbor as yourself in some way.
It does.
Similar.
And then he goes on to say, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So we've seen, starting off in that passage, that the wife should submit to their husband. And we see ending that passage that the wife should respect her husband.
Yeah.
But we see sandwiched in the middle there what type of husband she's supposed to submit to.
Yeah.
And what type of husband she's supposed to respect.
Yeah.
And that is a Christ-like husband. That is a husband who puts her first. Yeah. A husband who's willing to sacrifice for her. A husband who understands his most important role is to see that she is sanctified.
Yeah. Yep, that's good. All right. So, okay. So we've pretty much walked through the text at this point.
I've got a question for you.
Okay, all right.
Okay,
Let's go for it.
We've looked through Ephesians 5.
Yeah.
And reading through that, I'll be the first to admit that sounds hard.
All right.
That sounds hard.
Yeah.
So we're going to struggle with that. That's going to be something that we fail to do regularly.
Yeah.
I could admit that.
Yeah.
We fail to do this regularly because it is difficult.
Yeah.
So what can we do to make it easier
Yeah.
for us to follow that command?
Yeah. Oh, well, so you're kind of going the route that I was going to go with it, and that's more towards practical application here. So I would say that if you are a man, you need to be abiding with Christ constantly. The only way that you can grow in holiness in Christ likeness is by beholding and looking at Christ. Right? So that means that if you're looking at football more than you're looking at Christ, or basketball, or football, or baseball, whatever thing you're looking at more than Christ, you're going to look more like that than you are Him.
Right.
And what that goes for all sorts of things. That could be Netflix, that could be Hulu, that could be the internet, whatever. If we're not looking at Christ and focusing our gaze there, we're probably not going to look like Him. And if we're not, and if that happens, then we're not going to be dying to ourselves in our marriages. Yeah. So I would say that's probably where we should start. I would say that another thing that we should probably be doing, that ought to lead us to be doing, is praying a lot more. Like whenever you're hit with the weight of the responsibility that Paul lays out in Ephesians 5, I think that, oh my gosh, I fail at this. I mentioned that in my sermon this morning. This is something that I fail at. I think that that's one of the things that it's meant to do, and that ought to drive you to prayer.
Right.
Lord, not only help me, don't not just give me the desire to behold you and to set my gaze upon you and to abide with you, but also help me to be transformed, help me to be sanctified, give me the strength to do this. I would say that those are two ways. Another practical thing too may be practicing less, having less. This is going to sound a little monastic, but that's just the type of guy that I am. Anybody who knows me for any amount of time knows that I've got those types of leanings. But perhaps one of the reasons why we're so selfish towards our spouses is because we just have so much. You have so many things that you can set your eyes on other than Christ. You have so many other things that you are trying to protect other than your spouse. I don't think that it would be a bad thing to give something up.
Right.
Paul talks about, I'm not saying that things and possessions aren't a blessing in some way. I think that they are. But I think if we're tempted towards loving things more than people and loving things more than Christ, we have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And Christ talks about that if your right hand causes you to steal, or your left, whatever, your hand causes you to steal, the way that you deal with it is cutting it off. Right? Or if your eyes are prone to looking at sinful things, you pluck them out. We're not talking about really cutting off your hand here, or plucking out your eyes, but the principle here is you kill the thing. Right? You take it, you remove it. So if there's something that's getting in the way of you loving your wife and loving Christ and abiding in Him the way that you ought to, I would say start there. Take account of the things in your life that you have put up on a pedestal and are loving far more than you ought to.
And so something I'll point out that is in the same vein as what you're talking about, but it's going to be a little more focused on probably a little more focused on members of the Reformed camp.
Yeah,
is that we can tend to treating Christianity as a knowledge-oriented religion.
Yeah.
And so we're spending all of this time trying to learn as many things, to know as many facts as we can. And we can get, as odd as it sounds, we can get so lost even in Scripture itself, that we're not taking time to lead our families. And like I said, that's something we see more of in the Reformed camp than you'll see in other places.
Yeah. I think that is absolutely spot on. And here, it's been a while ago now, we had a community group at our home, and I said something. It was pretty basic, And the response of this thing that I said was this man's wife was like, "What? Like I didn't know that, and like that's pretty important. I feel like that I should have known this." And the man at that point, like, fessed up to me afterwards. He says, I knew what you said, but I never shared it with my wife.
Mm-hmm.
And I, he's like, I dropped the ball on making sure that she was thriving spiritually. And in my desire to learn and to grow and to get plugged in to studying good doctrine and theology, I forgot one of the most important things, which is to share it with others, right? And I think that what you're saying there is a real temptation for Reformed folks,
right,
to absolutely stuff our mind with so much theology, and man, that can lead to a lot of pride.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually what I was going to say. You get to a point where it's like, well, I'm at this level, and I know that my wife is down here significantly at a lower level.
That's on you.
But if she wants to reach this level, she can read all the things that I read.
Yeah.
She can listen to all the guys I listen to.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, okay, if I have more knowledge in Christianity, if I am farther along in my journey of sanctification, if I am further along in learning what being Christ-like means, but I'm not leading my wife in that same way, am I as far along as I think I am?
Yeah, probably not. And honestly, this was an area, at one point in my life, this was an area of struggle for me. I mean, as you can see, I have a lot of books, and that's about half of them that's in the frame, or maybe 3/4 of them. And for a long time, I had that problem. And whenever we planted a church, I found it out that my wife was not where she needed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I have done since then is, if I'm reading something, or if I've watched a video, or I've listened to a podcast, and there was something interesting that I learned in it, one of the things that I'll always do, whether she hates this now because she knows what I'm doing, but one of the things that I'll actually do is be like, hey, I was listening to a podcast today, and they said X, Y, and Z. Here's what I think about it. What do you think about it? And I do that with all kinds of things now. I do it with books that I read. I do it maybe with movies. Sometimes we'll just sit down and read things together. But that's some of the practical ways that I try to keep my wife engaged, is involving her in conversations. And it's actually, I think, pretty good for me, because I think for a long time I was kind of doing theology alone in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And now it gives it's a more communal way of doing theology, so it's also good for me. But that's some of the practical things that I've tried to do, and I've seen a big time difference in my marriage, because there's been times where I've said that to my wife and be like, I listen to this, and I'll think that she's not listening, and then later on down the road she'll hear something somewhere else or something, or maybe she'll hear something in a podcast she's listening to. She'll be like, oh, they brought up this. Do you remember whenever you said this? So that's a pretty easy and practical way to do it. And another thing you could do too is actually sit down and have structured discipleship time with your family.
Yeah,
that's another thing. So
yep. And so, like we said, these things are hard.
Oh yeah.
They take work. Mm-hmm. They take conscious effort. They're not going to just happen. Yep. You're not just going to fall into a pattern of doing these without effort. You're going to have to work to get here. Mm-hmm. But when we are truly in Christ, mm-hmm. and when we truly understand that our role in the life of our spouse is a picture of Christ's role in our life, it makes it a lot easier to do these things.
Yep. I'll say another thing too for men. It's time to man up and do your house responsibilities too. Okay. One of the things that I hear constantly from men is they'll talk about, it seems like my wife is always nagging me, no matter what I'm doing. Always nagging me to take out the trash, always nagging me to do something around the house. And I would say that this is also your responsibility too. Your wife shouldn't be nagging you. Yeah. She shouldn't be nagging you to take out the trash. She shouldn't be nagging you to do things around the house. Now, I'm not saying that there's not going to be times when she's like, hey, could you do this? Could you do that? But if she's constantly on you about it, it's probably a good indication that you're not taking responsibility for that. And so really what she's asking you whenever she wants you to take out the trash isn't, hey, you're annoying me, take out the trash. Maybe she is. But what she's really asking you to do is help me in making things beautiful. Mm-hmm. Help me do what I was designed to do. Right. Help me to do what I was created to do. Right? So I think that if we can I think that takes sanctification to see something from that angle instead of the other angle. Right? And so I would say that if you're a man and you have that, man up, and also it shift your perspective a little bit here.
Right, and we can take that back to the Christ Church relationship. If your wife asking you to do something annoys you, imagine the church asking Christ to do something.
Right.
Is he annoyed?
No. I hope not.
Right.
Right.
So it's the same thing in that relationship. When she asks you to do something, you shouldn't be annoyed. Yep. You should be, just like Christ is, overjoyed at the opportunity to serve and to help and to lead.
Yep. I think that's good. So I don't think I have anything else to add to that.
I think I'm about done too. So next week we're going to be getting into Genesis 3. So I don't know if we'll probably talk about the fall. I don't know if we're going to get into the punishments of the fall, or if we're just going to get into what the fall was. I don't know if you've planned that far ahead.
I haven't got that far ahead yet. There's some things that I do want to touch on before we get into some of that stuff. Maybe I'll fit it all into one sermon. Maybe I won't. But I do want to talk about some of the structure of the garden in some ways, with the trees and with some of the rivers coming out. That becomes important later in Genesis. There's tree themes and motifs that get repeated, and so I might bring some of that out. I don't know. I've not figured it out yet, but we'll definitely be in Genesis 3. That's for sure.
Yeah. So next week we'll be getting into Genesis 3. So if any of you all have any questions about anything we've talked about so far in creation of the world, creation of man, woman, marriage, any of that, you have any questions, feel free to send them to us. If you have any questions about what's coming up in Genesis 3, feel free to send those to us as well. You can do that through the Facebook video. You can leave a comment there. You can leave a comment on the YouTube video. You can send us a message through Facebook Messenger, or you can send us an email. Go to New Haven WV, click the Resources tab at the top of the page, and then click Talks at New Haven, and there's a form there where you can submit an email. So we'd love to answer any kind of questions that you have.
Yep. All right. Well, I've only got one last thing to say, and that's man up.
All right. We will leave you on that, and we will see you next week.
See you guys next week.